Welcome everyone again. It's great pleasure to see a lot of students, especially. Thank you so much for making your time and joining into the session. Just quickly, a couple of things. As you know, the session will be recorded and publicly available afterward. So if you don't mind, it may be better for you to turn off your camera and mute yourself unless you're a speaker or you have questions to ask. Great. And all right. Thank you. Okay, so let's start this. And it's my greatest pleasure to have Tony today and introduce Tony to everyone here. Thank you so much. So Tony is a professor at Bradley University in Chicago in USA. So it's like 6:30 in his time, which is the perfect time of the day for him to talk about the art of autoethnography. I know that. However, I particularly have to say thank you for your willingness to do it despite the time difference. So welcome. So Tony is also author of many books of autoethnography and on autoethnography. And one of the textbooks that we are using for the program, E-Research and Technology in Enhanced Learning, he's the author of it. He seems to have this magic power to explain this complicated idea of autoethnography in the comprehensible way for our first year doctoral students. So we've been all benefiting from his writing. So he is also author of many articles, journal articles. If you haven't had a chance to read some of them, I strongly recommend you to, after the session, go and Google him, because his articles are not just, as you can imagine, simple academic writing. It's really in-depth and personal, reflective, critical piece that give us a lot of insights about understanding the society and many issues of society. So by just saying that, I can keep going, but I know that given the nature and topic of conversation, Tony, I expect you to explain yourself or kind of introduce yourself a little bit in your session. So I will probably stop doing this because I know that you would do it in a much more elegant way than I could possibly do. But warm welcome, and floor is yours. I shall enjoy the talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for being here, spending some time with me today. Thank you for making this visit possible. This is a really cool opportunity. So let me share my screen. I'm going to pull up the chat box. Feel free to interrupt as I'm going through, whatever you want, throw stuff in chat. Hopefully when I teach and do this stuff, I love to make this as interactive as possible. I think that's where the cool conversations happen. I'm going to walk you through some of my approach to doing autoethnography. I've called this the Art of Autoethnography. I'm going to spend a bit more, just a bit more time on the craft of autoethnography, which I'll explain in a moment. But when I think of the art of autoethnography, I think of the process of doing autoethnography as well. So this is it's sort of looking, usually when I do, and this just happened so far in my career, I'm a writer. I love writing. I call it my exercise. I've edited and written a lot of books, and one thing that I've noticed across my books that I never intended going forward is autoethnography is somewhere in the title of all of them except for one of them, the little blue book about sexuality that came out last year. So it's this method sort of, I came into the method and it has built itself up around me as well, and I just love playing with ideas and practices of what we can do with this method. So when I think of art, I like to start at a very, I should say this, some of this talk stems from a book chapter that I wrote with Stacey Holman Jones, who is a professor at Monash University in Australia. And we wrote a chapter called The Art of Autoethnography. So some of the structure at least comes from that. And I can share that chapter with the organizers after this. I have a few articles I will share with everybody too, as we go through this. So when I think of the art of autoethnography, I approach that concept in the concept of art in terms of process and what we do to do autoethnography, and I also focus on the craft of autoethnography. What are the skills involved to doing meaningful, maybe even what we would call good autoethnographic work? So you will see today that I've structured some of the main points around process and craft. I want to offer, this is when I think of what autoethnography is for me and how I approach thinking through this concept, this method, this what Art Bachner calls a way of life. This is the visual I have, and I've been playing with this. I've been playing with this visual for now about a decade, and I've actually never actually printed this model anywhere because I play with it too much and I adjust it, and sometimes I think it's better as circles, and sometimes I see it much more of a top-down structure. My approach to autoethnography, it involves three components when I come to this term. And I think all three of these components need to be present somehow, somewhere in an autoethnographic text. So we can break up autoethnography in terms of the auto, the ethno, and the graphy. And then that's what I've done with this chart. I've split it up. When I think of the auto part, I get into the genres of life writing, autobiography, memoir, personal essay, autofiction, possibly. And everything, here's the key part, everything that comes with the practice, the craft of life writing is fair game, is put into play when we think about the concept of autoethnography. On the flip side, ethnography to me is a method of doing social science research. It is a way of studying cultural life. We do things, there are practices associated with ethnography. There are histories of ethnography, some good, some not so good. The practices of ethnography also come into the practice of autoethnography. I see that as the second key part of this. And the third part of this is this graphy. And broadly speaking, the problem, the difficulty I have with this chart all the time is where do I put this graphy? But this is an attention to the craft, to the representation of our work. And I ask myself, what do ethnographers do when they represent their work? And what do autobiographers, life writers do when they represent their work? And that's how I go into the graphy. And there are some key overlaps between what I would call good ethnographies and good life writings, good memoirs, good autobiographies. Both of those, what counts as good ethnographies, good autobiographies, good life writing, at least for me, get us into what autoethnography is and does. I put this chart up not to be prescriptive and not to, the caution I have is that autoethnographies don't have to have all of these components. But I want to emphasize a few of them. So I've made the autobiography part visually a bit smaller than the ethnography because autobiographers, of course, there's a lot to the craft, and this is an area that I do a lot of work trying to learn about what the practice of autobiography, the practice of life writing. But some key parts that I pull out of the genre of life writing are folks use personal experience. I think autoethnographies, you must have personal experience somewhere, your personal experience somewhere as the researcher. If your personal experience isn't there in the text at the very least, from my perspective, you're not getting into the autoethnography territory. I then asked myself, what do good memoirs do? What do good autobiographies do? my answer to that is they offer lessons about living, they offer insight into a person's decision-making, how they move through the world, how they traverse particular contexts. Those kinds of, maybe there are voices and stories that haven't been told yet. Sounds a bit similar to finding the gap in research. Autobiographers and memoirists do this. And the last part of this that I'm going to bring in the graphy is that good life writers, think of if you've ever read a memoir, autobiography, any kind of life writing, what do they do? How do they craft that text? What techniques do they use in that representation? That matters. That comes into the discussion of autoethnography. Not necessarily, you don't have to use all of these things. That would be overwhelming and, dare I say, impossible. But you should at least engage some practices of how autobiography works. Ethnography, they have different kinds of needs and desires and goals from my perspective. All ethnographies don't do all of these little boxes, but I would say all ethnographies do at least some of these. I don't want to necessarily quantify it, but I would say at least 2 or 3 of these practices should be a part of all ethnography somehow. That's up to the project, that's up to the researcher which ones. Notice that I've put the use of personal experience, I've brought it into ethnography. There have been tons and tons of ethnographers who bring personal experience into their ethnographies. That doesn't necessarily make them autoethnographic. You have to use personal experience in particular ways. But personal experience is a common part of ethnographies and has been for decades. And maybe the personal experience was never included in the primary ethnographic text, but maybe that personal experience was included in another text, maybe in the form of diaries, reflections on a research career, maybe biographies that somebody wrote about a researcher, etc. Ethnographies also do certain things, interviews. They focus on cultural expectations and issues and contexts. They value some things such as fieldwork and natural settings and this concept called participant observation. Good ethnographies know the existing research, and this could be academic research or this could be very popular press representations about a topic. Maybe theories come into play. This is the academic component, definitely comes in with ethnography, probably less so with memoirists and life writers. They probably don't care about strict academic theory, some do, but I wouldn't put that in the autobiography category. And there are goals of ethnography to, at the very least, facilitate a cultural understanding of a cultural issue, a context, a group. The graphy of ethnography, I always, if you go to find your favorite ethnographies, they're often book linked. I mean, there are plenty of journal article linked, but ethnographies often lend themselves to books just because of the amount of time and data and field work a person, an ethnographer, might undergo. However, these ethnographies are still often very compelling text. Even if you go back to the work of Clifford Geertz, Geertz's ethnographies, discussions of ethnography are very compelling, engaging. They use some of the same kinds of storytelling practices that life writers use. The one thing before we leave this screen, the one thing I want to note is that and I still even see this on social media when people ask about autoethnographies. Some people will say, oh, can autoethnographies have interviews? Of course they can. Ethnographers have interviews. Ethnographers interview people. I'm an autoethnographer. I've included interviews in my projects. That's perfectly fine. I've also included my experience alongside those interviews, or I'm using my experience to do something with an analysis of these interviews. Amir Marvasti Amir Marvasti has a great article called "On Being Middle Eastern American," and it's a great article in terms of, it's a great autoethnography, especially because Amir has very traditional formal interviews, but also brings in his personal experience and creates very compelling tales situated within academic discourse. It's a really, really good essay, and I can share this. Some of the articles I reference, I'll share with the organizers after this, and they can send them to you. So to stay on this point, at least with the autoethno and graphic, I'll show you the screen in just a moment again. But I want to emphasize again that all three components are present in autoethnography. If you asked me to name 5 classic books that have informed my view and practice of autoethnography, here they are. What I want to emphasize is that 2 of these books are very explicitly ethnographically focused, and then 2 of these books are much more life writing focused, and then you have Carolyn's Ellis's Ethnographic Eye that brings these together. Mannon first wrote his book Tales of the Field, wonderful book, 1988, reprinted in 2009. Fantastic book, but what you see in this is not only the practice of ethnography and the writing up of ethnography, but you also see the importance of the craft of doing so, telling compelling stories. You see the same kind of messaging in Goodall's Writing the New Ethnography. That's a wonderful book, 2001. Very informative from an ethnographic perspective. And then I go to the life writing folks. Anne Lamont's Bird by Bird is very formative in my world. First published in '94, reprinted 25 years later. There, see some love for Bird by Bird in the chat. Yes, it's a really, really sweet book. Stephen King's book about memoir of the craft, really a great tale. Helpful advice to use with autoethnography. And Carolyn's book merges, I would say, does a wonderful job merging these discourses of ethnography and life writing in her textbook about autoethnography that uses a lot of composite characters, slides into some fiction. I wanted to highlight, though, an entire section of the book that is absolutely key, that she brings in this discussion of thinking like an ethnographer. I would add researching like an ethnographer and writing like a novelist. Absolutely, both of those. This is what I would say makes autoethnography so difficult, is that both of those should be present somehow. There should be a concern about craft. There should be some personal experience. There should be a discussion of cultural issues. That's bringing all 3 of those together. I want to start, so I've divided this up. I have 2 main slides. One is the art of fieldwork, and one is the art of representation. And in my mind, I often start with thinking of one of these as process and product, if we want to use those kinds of terms. We do ethnography. We also produce ethnographies. We do autobiography. We also produce autobiographies. But I wanted to highlight some. When I think of the art, when I think of the process and the craft of autoethnography, that gets me into the art of doing fieldwork. And what does fieldwork mean for the autoethnographer? And these are some of the key points that I want to emphasize that I see emerging throughout a lot of autoethnographic works. And I want to touch on a few of these, but I'm going to be mindful of time, that some of these we can come back in the Q&A and talk through some of the issues. Autoethnographers, here's here's where these all come together, is that there is an emphasis on natural settings, and I'm actually going to uh, put the everyday life as research. I should put that under the natural setting categories and these informal, unsolicited conversations. Ethnographers value natural settings where life happens, where life, it's not an experiment. We aren't doing surveys. We might interview people, but we're also doing some observational work about particular cultural issues. In a lot of my work, I explore coming out of the closet and disclosing same-sex attraction and queer identity to other people. If I tell you that that's my research and the work that I do, let's just take, I often use the example of coming out of the closet and disclosing sexuality. Where's my field? Where's my natural setting? Where does that happen? Where do people come out of the closet? And we see this in so many ways, and this can be overwhelming because there's such a huge field that this can happen all of the time. For me, I latch onto these, in some of my work, I latch onto these informal conversations that happen maybe at the grocery store or the pub or the bank or on the street, that where a coming out happens that sure wasn't expected. And as a researcher, and this is one of the complications of autoethnography, and especially involving others, I don't know when I might be tasked with this concept, let's say, of coming out. I also don't know when others are going to come out to me. But to even add to this, if we take a very sterile view of research participation, and let's just say that I need informed consent when this happens. I don't carry around informed consent forms with me in everyday life. I don't know when the topic of sexuality is going to come up in everyday conversation. But that's where the autoethnographer comes in and says, no, I'm the research instrument, and I'm going to tell you when it appears and how it appears. With autoethnography, one thing I want to mention that I think that with autoethnography, because of that personal experience, there's a certain kind of investment by the autoethnographer in the research product and process. And this matters because if you go back to, I mean, this, I don't want to say remedies at all, but there's a different kind of accountability. What you see less and less is the lone ethnographer hopping into a random, to use the terrible term, exotic cultures. The lone ethnographer hops in, writes about these others, leaves, publishes something for their own benefit, never engages these others again at all. Probably very different others historically. Not so much anymore, thankfully. But with autoethnography, there's a push that there's an investment by the autoethnographer, that they're not going to leave their participants. There's a care there. There is, I hesitate to say that there is a shared experience, because you can do autoethnographies about experiences that you may not have, but there might be ways to write about those experiences that at least make you invested in the issues that you bring up. So there's some kind of investment there. The art of fieldwork from the autoethnographer's perspective, from my perspective, autoethnography is a very ethical enterprise, a very ethical act, not in the sense of autoethnographers. This isn't to say that they make the right decisions or they know how research happens in particular contexts. What I would say, though, is that autoethnographers should take ethical issues seriously. And this goes back to this investment and care the autoethnographer might have in a project. So some questions that come up, you probably are very familiar with procedural ethics if you have human subject review boards. Situational ethics, you get into contextual issues, contextual ethical issues, relational ethics. Carolyn Ellis has written wonderful articles about what do we owe our participants and how much do we care? And then how do we leave that field, and can we leave that field? I'm going to go back here to the life writing genres that if we're telling about our lives, which is a part of autoethnography, it's very hard to exit our life, if not impossible. But this is how I think through autoethnography. What do autobiographers do? What do ethnographers do? So this gets into issues of what does consent mean? Who can offer consent in our projects? How often do we ask for consent? I'll throw up some examples. And what is the extent of consent? So this is a question I often ask my students when I teach research methods, that we're told that consent can be, at the very least, just permission to be included in a research project by somebody else. I would say it goes way beyond this. Do you share your transcripts if you do interviews with your participants? I would even say, do you share your final write-up with your participants to give them a chance to offer some feedback? This all comes into the issue of consent, because the write-up of the article is very different from the transcript, and the framing might mean something very different to a participant than the transcript in the interview that they did. Autoethnographers constantly wrestle with this question, do no harm. This isn't just procedural, this is relational. I don't want to hurt people with my words, but how do I convey my experiences without hurting people? And who gets to determine what counts as harm? And you get into issues. We might start, think of the life writer. I'm going to tell my story. I'm going to share my personal experience. I need to share some personal experience in order to get into the autoethnographic component. However, by sharing my personal experience, I might risk, not only is it hard for me to maintain confidentiality and anonymity, but I'm also going to implicate others in my work. Sometimes if I tell a story about my life and I mention a parent, one of my parents, you could probably find with a little work, my parents who I'm talking about, and does that matter? I approach this, well, how do autobiographers and memoirists deal with this issue, and how do ethnographers deal with this issue? No easy direct answer, but there are some lessons and ideas about how to do this, which I'll talk about when we get into craft. The last thing that I want to emphasize with the art of fieldwork, and then I want to get into some examples of what people do and some of the autoethnographers that I think are really exemplary. Which personal artifacts do we use? So think of this, if I use the term data collection, with autoethnographies, if you latch onto personal experience, you might get into the world of using photographs. You might be sharing experiences from the past. This becomes a question, what experiences do we use in an autoethnographic project? And then what are the issues surrounding that use? Are we able to use those things? Who is implicated by the use of these personal artifacts? Do we need others to approve our stories? One of the frustrating, at least in the States, one of the frustrating things the issues that I have about autoethnography related to, I'm thinking of human subjects clearance. In the States, folks doing autobiography and memoir and life writing, they don't, that's a silly question. They don't do human subjects work for that kind of creative work. However, ethnographers, especially if they are interviewing people, they do that work. And so this becomes, what is this balance of trying to get this approval? And do we need to seek approval? Some places do, unfortunately. Now, some places have completely left off autobiography, memoir, creative writing from human subjects, institutional review boards. approval. Some though have it now because of autoethnography, saying if you're writing about your life, you might need to get permission from others. Again, a question that there's no easy answer. It's just more of issues that you might encounter when doing this work. And then you have the other part of, which I'll come back to when we get into representation, of how do we work with the past, especially with the inaccuracies of memory, and how do we accommodate this, and what happens if we, remember something that happened when we were 5 or 8, and how do we use this? How do we work around framing this? How do we speak to the accuracy, inaccuracy of this? Memoirists do engage these conversations. Ethnographers engage these conversations in terms of the truthfulness, and you want to convey the how do we deal with the possible slippages we have when thinking about the past. Combination of personal experiences, primary image, absolutely, yes, and hoping you all will come at this conversation in very different ways, and that's one way you might see autoethnographic components in your projects, absolutely. So these are some of the when I think of the art of ethnography, the purpose of ethnography, from my perspective, the drive for the method, there's something with this method, the requiring people to go into the field, whatever that field is, for a certain amount of time. I often use the line that good ethnographers go into the research field for at least a year, whatever that context is. You do this for a few reasons. It's not just the time spent and the collection of data that's happening, but you do this also because you want to infiltrate, you want people who you are working with, living with, studying, you want people to drop their front stage. The goal of ethnography, the goal of the time, is to get through the facade and see how life is lived. However, when you spend a lot of time with people, relationships develop, and it becomes very difficult to figure out what's on the record, what's off the record. Carolyn, in this is a wonderful article from the mid-90s. She revisits it in her Telling Secrets, Revealing Lives essay. There are a lot of just gems in this article. One of them being Carolyn spent many years studying this community of fisherfolk. That was her first book. And she talks about these moments. She did everything right as the ethnographer. She got the IRB approval. She got folks' consent. But what she found was that she asked people if she could study them when she got there, or if she could include them, their stories, and they agreed. And as the ethnographer, she was very present, and she would take notes and have conversations with people. But after a certain amount of time, people forgot she was an ethnographer. People didn't say, this is on the record, this is off the record. They became used to Carolyn. It was just Carolyn. This is my friend Carolyn who's here. That's the benefit and the consequence of ethnography. You want to go study how life happens as the ethnographer. However, in doing that, you make relationships, and it becomes really tricky to figure out what consent means. How often do you come out as the researcher? Hey, I've been here for 3 years. I'm gonna remind you every day I'm the ethnographer and I'm watching you. No, that's not what ethnographers do, because you need this long-term immersion. And it's a mix of manipulation, deceit, but also finding the goal of ethnographers is to study life as it happens, which is helpful from the perspective of social research. What's fascinating, Carolyn has this line in there that she, after spending so much time with these folks, she realized that these people she was talking with may have been deceiving her too, by telling her really exaggerated stories, and vice versa. How to interpret this. So even though she's spending so much time here that in this place doesn't mean that you're going to get the truthfulness or inaccuracies, because the cultural members might have different kinds of fronts, maybe in the story of stories, maybe in the form of stories to do this. Using personal artifacts, ethics are alongside here. This is, again, for the artfulness stuff. This is a great book. Buddy Goodall wrote this. This is a wonderful book. And Buddy wrote this book because he didn't, his Buddy died, I think, in 2011. Prominent ethnographer, did some really cool stuff. His father died in 78 and his mother died in 83 or so. And he talks about his son coming to him in the early 2000s and asking about his parents, and Buddy not knowing. He had a very sterile, basic story about who his parents were. However, when his son asked him that 20 years later, Buddy realized he didn't have a story to tell about his parents. And so he went to do research, went to do a lot of archival research. He found out, it's a very compelling book because he found out his father was a spy, but what was even bigger, here's the ethnographic side of this, is that being a spy required, again, good or bad, there are benefits and consequences to spying. We have spies for a particular reason. What he found was that the documents created to support his father's job as a spy, documents created by the US government, there were multiple files. He calls these dummy folders, to steer people in different directions. So one of my favorite moments, there was an application for his father applying. He found this application his father used to apply for a job that listed his work in, I think it was Virginia, but his father was actually living in, I think it was Montana or Wyoming at the same time, and he includes these artifacts in the text to build a story of his life that he can share with his son, but also to call attention to the practices, what I would consider the shady practices of how, in his case, I would think he would argue that the government contributed to the failure of a family and a significant amount of pain. This is an article about sexual assault, just as a warning, but we won't hop into the necessary details of this, but I just want to highlight, this is a really powerful piece. Reagan Fox wrote this in 2019. It's called Dirty. This is a great article about working with the past, but also a great article about dealing with memory, because Reagan starts this argument throughout the whole article. Reagan has these moments where he talks about remembering being assaulted as a child by one of his brother's friends, but he gets to the point where he writes this, which is really beautiful and painful. He writes these moments where he will say, I remember this happened, and then my memory's fuzzy and I don't know. He leaves it up to us. He tries to demonstrate the limits of his memory. But one thing he does, though, and this is really vulnerable, he includes some really intense images from his life. One, figure 2 is this scenes from his 6th grade yearbook, where he actually latches onto the language used that he wrote on these pictures. He was like, what 6th grader would write this kind of language? Something was going on at the time. How did at 6th grade I knew these words? This is what Reagan's writing. And why so much aggression there? He also includes a psychological evaluation, and he reprints it in this article. And that's the first figure. And again, he's including this alongside his story and trying to make sense of what happened. Another essay, and I'll send this again to the organizers to share with you, and I'll come back to this one also because this is one of my favorites. Shelley Carter. That's not Shelley Carter. That's a pseudonym, which we can also talk about why that happened, why she used that pseudonym. Shelley used very traditional academic research. I love this. Very traditional academic research alongside journal diaries, again about sexual, this one deals with sexual assault as well. And she pushes her personal diaries up against academic research, and she shows the dilemmas that you need both simultaneously. The general research, extant research about sexual assault can tell us really wonderful themes about what it is, how it occurs. The journal entries, the diaries show the everyday moments, these moments where assault can happen, and actually these confusing moments. She has a powerful line in there. She's talking about domestic abuse, her husband's assaulting her. She has this great line in there where she says, when is that bump, that slight nudge in the kitchen? When does that go into abuse? Was there intentionality in that act? And what are the dilemmas of saying that was abusive when it could be very innocent, or maybe it wasn't very innocent and it was abusive? She includes these moments in her diaries. It's really a powerful work. I want to be mindful of time and definitely get into the craft of the art of representation, because this is just as important as the processes we do to do autoethnography, to do ethnography, to do life writing. And I go back to the art of representation again. This requires, what do ethnographers say about representation? What do life writers say about representation? What do autoethnographers say about representation? All of these folks talk about representation. They all emphasize the need. They all emphasize process, but they also emphasize craft. And that's something, unfortunately, I think is lost from many autoethnographies that I read. I think they're boring, some. And this, I just want to push back and say, tell us a story. Where's that ethnographer in you? Where's that ethnographers tell good stories? So do autobiographers and memoirists. They tell good stories. Where are you? Come tell us this good story. Good with the ha-ha. Here's the last main slide, and then I have some examples just to walk through. These, I'm focusing on writing here only for the purpose of this discussion, but you have folks using various media to represent their autoethnographic work. Art, I'll show you some art, some music, video work, just a variety of mediums, but I want to focus on writing. At the very least, ethnographers call for thick description, and read up on thick description, because good ethnographies engage in thick description. Well, when you read about thick description, you get into stuff like the need for concrete details, the ability to recreate a scene. Geertz is credited with thick description, but it actually stems back to Gilbert Ryle's essay. I forgot the title of it, but I will send that one to you. That distinguishes between thick and thin description. And Ryle has a great issue with thin description, and they actually focus on, and I use this a lot in my work, determining when is a wink a wink. When somebody winks at you, thick description really shows that wink is, you show us the context and what makes that wink a wink. Thin description, is that wink just a blinking of the eye? Is it rehearsed? Is somebody acting? Does somebody have a twitch? Are they flirting with you? Do they have a question? Are they telling a joke? All of these possibilities just around such a mundane gesture. The ethnographer is going to come in with thick description and say, this is why it's a wink, because here are all the other factors, and let's tell some compelling tales. Yeah, I do that. Ethnographic writing is boring because the author is trying to, absolutely. Absolutely, in some way that feels forced. The qualifier, though, is that you can be very academic and still tell a good tale. So I don't want to. So my impulse is to say yes. They're just trying to force. I get it. We have these traditional academic structures, but I mean, I'm even thinking of representation, the intro, lit, review, method, findings, discussion, conclusion. That even that preformed structure is going to impede, limit some of our creativity. But yeah, I would say that this is where I latch on to the life writers. If you're doing autobiography, bring them in. Why? They aren't boring. If they are boring, they probably aren't getting published. Ethnographers, again, the same thing. Ethnographers have called for compelling text for years too. This is what I don't. I see is a slight disconnect that not only do you have the life writing component, but you have ethnographers who have said, no, ethnographies aren't boring. Read Mannon's work that he published in the 80s. It's wonderful and very, very compelling. Yeah, that's it. Yes, it's wonderful. Yeah, the Ryle papers. Yeah, those are really cool to read. Writing is inquiry. I put this up here as a moment that I'll tell you a frustrating moment that I hear with my students, with some of my colleagues, even one of my besties right now who's finishing his dissertation or his dissertation. Autoethnographers value this concept of writing as inquiry. Laurel Richardson, Elizabeth St. Pierre really developed this concept. And here's what makes me nervous is the person who says, I know what I want to say, I just haven't written it yet. That makes me very nervous. I want to say, yeah, I'm sure you have some ideas about what you want to say, but I also want to add, when you get into the doing, when you get into the craft of making, of writing your articles, of writing your dissertation, you're going to learn new things in that process. What they will be, I have no idea, and you don't either. So save some space for that in terms of the writing up. There are some issues. These are, I love playing with these issues. If we're using personal experience, when do we implicate others in our work? How do we negotiate this? Another key distinction that I want to mark that I see folks struggle with, the ethics of representation matter only if we share our work. And I think that's the moment where people struggle with, it's that act of sharing our work. We can have our own personal diaries, and we can write whatever we want in those diaries. And there aren't any obvious ethical concerns from doing that. The ethical concerns happen if we take that diary and we want to publish it as a book or as an article. That's where these ethical issues come in. I often say, as writers, as somebody who writes and publishes a lot, I have a lot of power, not in the sense of controlling things in the world, but in terms of conveying and putting my version of stories into the world. I have a lot of power in that. So much so, some people that I implicate, I'm thinking of my parents, they don't have that same kind of power, maybe in the form of knowledge. If I write something about my parents, there's nothing they can do to respond outside of maybe we get into some legal issues. They couldn't publish the same thing as a counter response. They don't have that skill. They don't have the skill of craft to do this. They don't have the access. They don't have the knowledge. And that's not a slam. It's just that's or a critique. That's just not the skill set they have. So when I tell my story and it might implicate them, I try to be very mindful that they won't have a chance to respond. And so I think about ways trying to offer multiple perspectives. Maybe I ask them on sometimes for certain experiences. An example, I put up this with historical truth versus narrative truth. And this is a moment where different interpretations of events and working with the past matter. So in my first book about coming out of the closet, I share this moment. I'm reflecting on times in my past where there was this sliver, this seed where same-sex attraction, my queerness bubbled up that I didn't know what to call it at the time. And I include this scene when I was 7 years old. About we had just got this cable satellite television system installed in our house, and I had my own TV in my room. And at 10 o'clock, 10:30, I was watching TV, and there was I remember there being some kind of pornography on the television, and there were a bunch of naked men. I don't know what channel I was watching. What I do remember is that my father came in, started screaming at me, turned off the TV, spanked me, whipped me, screamed at me, and I use this in my book. That's the story, and I include this in my book as a moment of where my same-sex attraction, my sexuality was being policed. It's a memory that I have of that event. I gave the book to my mom. She read it. She was so upset by the story that I told about my father because it implicated her as a parent. I didn't mention her at all, but it implicated her as a parent. And she said, "That never happened. I never would have let your father hurt you in those ways." And then I said, "But Mom, I remember him doing this," and she was like, "I never would have done this, and if that did happen, I didn't know about it." And she was worried about even though I don't engage her, I was implicating her as a parent by telling my story of an encounter I had with my father. I tell you this now because it's these moments that add to my credibility as an autoethnographer, that now when I write and now when I share the story, I'm going to offer multiple perspectives and to show you that I've done research on my life and the stories I'm telling, and I'm going to add these qualifiers, and I'm going to let you decide as the reader what you believe and also the nuances of memory. Here, I throw this quote with Anne Lamott: "You own everything that happened to you. Tell your stories. Folks should behave better if you don't want them to tell your stories." I like that as a push, but I don't think that's a good ethical practice. I think it's much more complicated. But again, it's this good moment to figure out, well, what do life writers do? What do ethnographers do when they tell stories? The last thing I want to mention, and I'll run through some examples, or last two things: storytelling techniques. If you've been trained in traditional academic research, you probably haven't read books strictly about writing, especially about creative writing. Art Bachner throws out the line, "We're often trained to be good researchers. We're never trained to be good writers." This takes a lot of work. This is what makes autoethnography very difficult, is that do this work, read other works of fiction, of nonfiction, of creative nonfiction. What techniques do folks use? What makes a good story? Y'all should, if you're doing autoethnography, you should ask yourselves that. Y'all know what a good story is. You probably have a favorite book or a favorite movie. What makes it good for you? What makes it compelling? Why do you talk about it? Why do you care about it? Your answers to that question, bring that into your autoethnographic work, because that's going to be so helpful. And then I want to just show you some examples of what people do with working with literature. So here's just a few things that people have done in terms of craft. I've focused on writing. I'm a writer. I don't use other media to represent my work. Sometimes a little bit of poetry, but Again, it's much more prose-based. My work is much more prose-based. But here are some examples of other people who have brought in various media to their autoethnographic works. One is a chapter in the first edition of the Handbook of Autoethnography by Marilyn Mehta. This is a chapter, interestingly, about sexual assault. I didn't notice this pattern that I have a lot of examples about sexual assault in here. This is artwork that she co-drew, co-painted with another person, representing her stories. And they're just compelling images. She has these alongside her text that do certain different things. Csaba Asveth, he's in the right side. He has tons of glass work that he cuts by hand and assembles. You can see on the even on the video, this is a YouTube video. If you just do a search for this, Thinking with Bird on the Wire, this on the right is a glass sculpture piece of art that is his view of how Art Bachner's article Bird on the Wire is, what it means to him and how it works. And underneath that the pieces of glass are snippets of Art's quotes from his work. And then Csaba turned this into a video where Csaba also writes about talking with his dad, which is what Art's essay is about. Last thing, I'll move through some of these quickly. Dialogue, bring it in. Here's something from about one good line of dialogue tells us so much about a character that pages of description could never do. This is a snippet. One of my favorite parts of Robin Boylorn has this moment where the scene is Robin Boylorn is a Black woman living in the southern part of the United States. She goes into a grocery store. She's just there to buy food. She's going into the grocery store. She's just there to get food. And she goes to the deli counter and somebody strikes up a conversation with her. This white woman strikes up a conversation and says, so Robin talks about this moment, and then she writes about this woman saying, well, what are you doing to do here? Teach? And Robin then goes into this internal dialogue and says, wait, how did she know I was going to teach? She's tapping into some common ideas about race and articulation, and why did she go there? Is this a race issue? And then Robin responds, one line of dialogue, and then the woman responds, you talk so well, which is what Robin was worried about was going to happen. Race is now on the table in this everyday encounter at a grocery store. But I emphasize this because it's one line of dialogue. These little lines of dialogue say so much about the characters. And narrative voice. Autoethnographers, I love, we can talk about this in the discussion. Autoethnographers we often see a lot of work in first-person voice. I do a lot of work in second-person voice, and there are reasons for this. Some autoethnographers use third-person voice. Here's an example from Carolyn that's written in third-person voice. Jonathan Wyatt, whose work you may know, he has some work in third-person voice. Very important to juggling between voices can take us into experiences differently. And working with research, I want to highlight parts with Shelley Carter. I mentioned this before. She puts her experiences up against existing research. In my book about the closet, my opening chapter, I talk about my drive to study coming out of the closet, but I do so in a way where I'm bringing in research that aligns with my experience and the reasons that I make the argument why the closet is important to study. And the last technique that I love by Stacey Holman Jones is that right here, this is her. So I'm thinking about the academic question, are folks trying to be too academic? This is where I first said yes, but then I took some pause. I love Stacey's work. If you're reading the Green Book now, if you notice there are notes used in the Green Book, that is intentional, the little Green Book about autoethnography, because we wanted to go after accessibility. This is a good this is her primary text, but then she uses footnotes to tell a very different story, and she uses footnotes to bring in academic sources without cluttering the primary story. And I love Stacy's work because there's a story going on here, there's a story going on between these two, and there's also a story going on in just her notes. So whew.
Well
Thank
done.
you all.
Thank you. All right, Tony, if you stop sharing your screen, so
Yep.
you can have people on the screen. That's good. Thank you so much for that, thick description of all this art of ethnography. I really have to say that I enjoyed a lot, and I believe that everyone else did here. So we have a lot of questions.
Cool.
So, the first question I want to kick off the discussion with is that basically I think most of my PhD students always came to ask the same question in terms of whether we're worthy of research or being researched. So I think we have Kostas here, who may have relevant questions. Kostas, it was originally your question. Do you want to come and ask a question with your voice, please?
Okay, can you hear me?
Lovely, yeah.
Okay. My question was, we studied one of your books, Doing Autoethnography, and there was a point in which you said something about turning of the self and others inside out, doing some introspective word and extrospective observation. But I feel that some people may not have such epiphanies or life-changing events, or they may have because things happen, but they may not be sensitive enough to catch the event. So perhaps is autoethnography for everyone, or should some people leave it for others?
Yes, great question. I'm going to, and this is, it's trying to speak of, I'm trying to use language of ethnography, and sometimes I don't use language of life writers. I think all autoethnographies have research questions, and I think that the research question goes into the kind of question you're asking. Autoethnographers might not say, here's my research question, and here are my 3 research questions, and this is what I'm going to answer it. No, I don't think that's what happens. You have autoethnographers who, the research question for many autoethnographers, and I would say many ethnographers, starts with this: what's going on? Why? So I'm thinking of, so epiphanies are an easy, but as you know, folks might not have epiphanies, but epiphanies are these moments that send us, that they just, something happens and life changes in significant ways. That could be one way. The research question from my perspective is talking about what happened in that moment. How was life before this moment? What happened, and how has life changed? That's your research question, though you might not say that. Other autoethnographers latch onto very mundane activities. It could be mundane issues that happen maybe in the grocery store, such as Robin wrote about, but it could be, Derek Bolin does this work where he has an article about aesthetic moments, where he talks about relating with his father, and the stories he tells are actually really beautiful. But the essence of this chapter is just to say, it's much more of an appreciation kind of article, and that's the point. That's the research question is that drove. I would say he didn't use that language, but I would say that that's the question that drove him to write these accounts that are very sweet and loving. Mark Freeman does this work with his mom, who suffered from dementia, and he had, it sounds very catastrophic, but his writing, especially some of his later writing about relating to his mother, there's a sweetness to it. And in fact, one of his articles is all about the benefits of her having dementia. And that's there's a research question from he doesn't call it a research question, but I see him working against common sense assumptions about dementia. It's not all bad. Here are actually some joyful moments. And it's a really sweet, I like a lot of his work. Is that helpful? Yeah, cool.
Yeah, sure, of course. Thank you.
What would be actually useful is if you can say yes or no, Tony, to the question that, so actual question coming from some students is if they're straight while a white male, is can they still do autoethnography because they don't have any strong identity kind of related to question they are interested in.
You know what? I have yet to find somebody who has a life free of conflict. If you have one of those lives, then congrats. I always start, and this goes to the research question, and I don't, this isn't all, my next big autoethnography is actually it's a bittersweet. I think some autoethnography is really bittersweet and loving and painful simultaneously. I would say, gosh, what keeps you up at night? What do you struggle with? Because the things that you struggle with, the things that keep you up at night, the things that you worry about, my guess is that if you take those things that you worry about and you interrogate them and you think of them from various angles and you ask other people about them and maybe you even start reading about them, the things we struggle with, often there's a prominent cultural connection that you aren't the only one struggling with this. So maybe you don't have these particular identities and you can latch onto to write about, but I'm guessing that there are some moments of confusion. There are moments that generate some dissonance, moments that maybe even generate joy. You could start with, or what stories aren't being told. It's interesting that you even asked that question, because what's going on that we aren't getting those stories, or what kind of versions of those stories are we getting? What is that need to do so?
So thank you. So you're saying yes, isn't it?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh.
Good
yes.
to know. All right. So we have a question from Nick, who seems to know more about your story. So Nick, are you there?
Hi. Tony, thanks so much for such a beautiful presentation. I was just captivated all the way through. But I wanted to ask you, I know this is a personal story from your own life about your dad, the situation with your dad, but it particularly impacted me, your mum's reaction to that after the event. And I think the way you told the story was that, you know, she only really saw it at the point at which it was published and it was in the public domain. And I want to link that with what you said about offering multiple perspectives, whether you would revisit your method at this point. And the reason I'm asking is not to pry personally, but because I know I'm going to face these same ethical issues in my own PhD, where the kind of skeptical observer in me can see things that people I'm in relationship with are not something I would ever want to confront them with, because it's kind of personal. But as a researcher, it's important to say these things out loud. And how do I handle that whilst trying to honor the relationship that I have with these people? Sorry, that was a very long question. I'm sure it could have been more succinct.
No, this is where, so two things I want to start with is, I would say this is where it's so important to start with the memoir folks and the life writers. How do they write about these issues all the time? There's a great book called Family Trouble, and it's all about memoirists writing about the trouble they've gotten in because they've shared their experiences and their family's pissed off, and sometimes the family members don't talk with them anymore, or they've done a lot of, because of that story that may have been very innocent, that others might take offense to. It also boils down to the question of, if we are using our personal experience, this is a fundamental issue of can others dictate the kinds of experiences we share? This happened to me. How dare you say I can't share my view of this? But maybe you do put up some, maybe that's a moment where I share the struggles of wanting to share my struggles. And I would say being honest, I love honesty and transparency. And I think that's what qualitative researchers do very, very well. And I think that's one of the strengths of qualitative research. I think that's one of the strengths of autoethnography is that there's an honesty and transparency that says, hey, I'm trying to figure this out. I'm trying to do the best I can. I'm trying to help others. I'm trying to challenge these cultural issues that I see or an issue, or I'm trying to counter. I'm thinking of, in a lot of my classes, I use Adichie's The Danger of a Single Story. It's a great TED Talk on YouTube. And I have students writing about dangerous stories that have impacted their life, or very limited stories that have influenced how they move through the world. It's a balance between what, do we get to share our experience, and what oversight do others have? And if I did a second edition, I would absolutely include my mother's interpretation of that event. Probably in that case, in terms of form, I would include it as a footnote, only because I wouldn't want it to detract from the message that I'm getting. But I'm not going to, just because she tells me that it pains her, that doesn't, I'm also not going to say, oh my gosh, Mom, you're right. Yeah, I believe your version because it's truthful. I don't think we live like that either.
Because there's real power and honesty and transparency and vulnerability in your story, in your experience, that would be lost if you then...
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. I think the hard part is, determining what we share with other people. And I think the thing that I learned, especially from ethnographers, and this isn't a reason to do it or a reason not to do it, even the most innocent things that we might write about somebody might piss people off in ways that we may never know. Again, this was the reason I shared the experience with my mom. My mom's not referenced at all. I didn't think about my mom one bit when I'm sharing a story with my father, but she's saying, I'm implicated, even though I'm not mentioned. Ron Pelias, I don't know if you know Ron's work, but I took my first autoethnography class with Ron in 2002, and at that time, Ron would say that he wrote about his wife once, and she got so angry at him. And said, don't you ever write about me again. Ron just published a book of poetry in December, and there is a part in there where it says, he actually makes this public. He says, my wife won't let me write about her, and so I'm going to end the sentence here. And I want to say, you've just written a crap ton about her by not writing about her. And I think that it's a brilliant move, but it's this, it's
He's
really
going to
cool.
get in trouble.
All right, so probably we can leave there, but thank you so much for the question, Nick and Tony, for answer. I think we have a few questions about actually writing it up. Actually, Tony, when you kind of mentioned boring, the B word, I was like, gosh, because a lot of my students are so worried about, because they don't see them as a good writer and they have to submit this assignments, a lot of pressure already. And now you just like touch that. A critical, so thanks for doing that. But anyway, we have the question from, which is a relevant question from Marcus here in terms of the acceptability of autoethnography for the publication. So Marcus, are you there? Okay, cool.
Hello, yeah, I've just come on there. Hi, Tony, thanks very much. A really interesting talk there. And I don't know if you know, actually, you share a name with a very famous footballer in this country, Tony Adams, who wrote a really, really interesting and quite groundbreaking autobiography. I don't know, in the late 1990s or something like that, and it came out as being alcoholic and all those kind of things. It was very interesting.
Okay.
And I didn't ever used to read very much in that time, so an autobiography on football for me was just about palatable.
Great.
Anyway, yeah, so really interesting. Thank you very much for that. And so I work in a business school, and previously been a business owner, and have started to write about my experiences.
Yeah.
Mainly because when I read about a lot of academic texts about business and articles, I find them very, very uninformed and superficial, and they're not really getting to the nitty-gritty, etc. But when I then talk to academics in the business school about how to formalize those thoughts into articles, I generally come across a kind of a snobbery almost, and that business articles and stuff tend to have quite strong traditional methodologies, and in fact are often praised for their methodology over and above any sort of real value that they seem to add. So I was just sort of interested in your thoughts on that within the sort of that kind of context. I don't know.
So are you asking, can you do this work and publish it? What are the ways to win over your peers?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, yes, I'm wanting to publish stuff, and I'm on with an article at the moment where there was a call for papers that I wanted to answer, and I said what my approach is likely to be, autoethnography, and they were very, very cautious about that being a suitable approach for a 3-star or 4-star journal or something like that, because they want to use empirical studies that might have a load of data, but actually that people seem to hide behind data and not really understand the situation, and just say, oh, the data tells me this, therefore it must be true.
So my initial reaction is, in terms of publishing, there are tons and tons and tons of opportunities and folks to support this work. If you get into the question of, are those places for publishing, do they matter for your world and where you are working? That's a different question. Then we can get into those kind of specifics. I immediately think of Journal of Organizational Ethnography is a very, I would say, skews very business-y in terms of its content, but they also are very open to autoethnographic work, and they've published autoethnographies. Whether that publication will convince your peers that it's good.
Well, whether or not the peer, I don't mind what my peers think, but I do want to get information out there, that appears in relevant places, that challenges, some of the established thinking, if you like, especially in terms of methodology. And
I would even add, I loved how you framed your question too, because that's the kind, when I mentioned the research question, kind of the research question, very broadly conceived, not using those words, the impetus to write, that's what I think is this research question. When you said that existing research is so uninformed and doesn't take into account the nuances and the particularities, and that's the reason to work. And there's your argument. What can you show us that this work doesn't? And you've done your Buddy Goodall, and you probably heard this in your methods class. You're feeling it. If we are researchers, one thing we do is to fill a gap, complement existing research. You're doing, just in your framing of that, you've put forth the gap. And there's your literature review. You're doing your literature review. You might not call it that, because that's maybe a much more sterile approach, but you're saying, maybe that's your opening, saying, listen, I've read this book and this book and this book, and they're wonderful in terms of these lessons, but they fail to miss these particularities of being a business owner. And that's what I want to share. And then take us into your work. Tell it what's missing. what stories do you have that would help?
Yeah, sure. Great. Okay, that's
Thank
really
you
helpful.
very
Thank you very
much.
much for that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
That's
you.
brilliant. So, I mean, Tony, we have a few questions, but I think probably because the time, may I just ask a question for you to give a tip or 2 tips to doctoral students? So the difference that my doctoral students face at the moment is quite unique because they have 4 months to go to write autoethnography. So reading a book about creative writing is not quite option that they have.
Absolutely.
So within 4, they just learn about it like a month ago, and they have 4 more months to go, and all of them have interesting stories to begin with. However, from there, what is the best advice that you can give to them to get past my module?
I would say, I know this is probably said a lot. Embrace writing as inquiry. You might have ideas about what you want to say, but that's only part of it. That when you get into the writing, you will learn stuff as you go. Maybe there are new memories. Maybe something you mention is going to take you into a different area. If you ever do I love free writing. I have notebooks everywhere, and I like free writing, not because I know what I'm going to say, but it's because I don't know what I'm going to say. And free writing takes me there. And I want to throw that out there is do that, but you have to do that early. You can't wait until it's going to be pointless if you wait until the night before something's due. Start on that now. That would be the primary thing I would share. Yeah, that'd be the primary thing I would share. And not knowing the projects, that's what makes it, start early. That's really helpful, partially because the writing is inquiry.
Thank you. Yeah, people are saying, Raf says good tip. So certainly, I think we have just a couple more minutes. Maybe we can come to the question from Joshua about the methodology. Joshua, are you there? Is it okay? Yeah. Do you want to kind of briefly pose your question to Tony?
Yeah, sorry for such a late question. It's been a fascinating discussion and talk. Thank you. Just wondering what you think about the methodology as an expression of a feminist researcher, and can it be used as a way to sort of combat systems of positivistic research or research that's like a previous participant was just talking about that might be considered more reputable or more publishable? Do you feel like it's more of a, like Faulkner says, just a way of life? How do you feel about that?
Absolutely. At the very autoethnography taps into, and I think you have especially the folks who might dabble in what might be called critical autoethnography. There's definitely a feminist bent. You have folks rooting the practice in feminism. I'm thinking of Elizabeth Attori's work, who I think the title of her book is Autoethnography as Feminist something, I forgot the last word, that she published a few years ago. I think of one place that I root the need for autoethnography is that Reinhardt's in the 1984 talks about how so much of social science research is premised on a rape model, where we find people, we mine them for data, and we run away and we write about them for our advantage and not their advantage. And we let them hanging, we don't engage them anymore, et cetera, et cetera. That's from a very feminist perspective. A lot of her work is in feminist social science research. You also have a lot of autoethnographers who root this in post-colonial, decolonial work, indigenous work. You see a lot of folks rooting it, the practice in those sensibilities. And autoethnography, that specific term, autoethnography, has a certain career within academic contexts, but the practice of autoethnography has been around for centuries. And sometimes it's called, we see this in critical race theory, in terms of counter stories or testimonios or witnessing. So there are many approaches to don't be scared to bring in any of these kinds of parts. What was this last? You had one more part to that. Deconstructing.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. This is what I do think. Here's what I love, and I see the slow work that is being done. I call this progress. I don't think anybody, thankfully, any ethnographer, not autoethnographer, any ethnographer could ever publish an ethnography without some kind of reflexivity or positionality mentioned in the work, either in an intro, either in an epilogue, either in an appendix. That the need for the researcher positionality and reflexivity on the ethnographic process, the ethnographers, I don't think you could ever do that anymore that you once could. I think that's a good thing. That the folks who don't talk about their positionality in doing a project, they're suspect. And I want to say that you better embrace, you better identify who you are and some of your struggles. And I don't think you can't do traditional ethnography anymore, thankfully, because I think it was a very bad colonialist practice.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Let me just squeeze one more question, sorry, because Mihas has asked it twice. I think we have to take this. So is it possible for you to talk about the representation of self as fragmented and as an observer to the chain of events? I think that question first came up when you're talking about crafting the dialogue and event.
Yeah, I think that's very, very important. I'm going to try to make this quick, at least how I understand the question. I am nervous about folks who, a few things. I'm very nervous about folks who try to speak about an authentic or true self. I think that's a goofy thing to ask. I think it's contextual. I think we change with time. I forgot to mention earlier, somebody who asked about thinking about the past. Carolyn Ellis has a great book about revision. And the problem when we get into publishing, when I publish something, it's fixed in print and I can't change it anymore. But my life changes, my perspective changes. I see this coming into this question of a fragmented self, sort of. The other thing, an early thing that I wrote, and I would love to do this again because it was so much fun. I had an experience one time when I was living in Tampa, Florida, where I was walking. I was walking down the street, and sorry for the language I'm going to use. A car passed me, and said, car drove past me, a pickup truck, and somebody screamed at me, I fucked your mom, faggot. And then drove on. And I'm just by myself at night walking down the street, and it scared me. But I take that moment and I write this experience. However, I write that experience in 4 different ways, saying it could be this, it could be this, it could be this, and it could be this. But what was great about this is that all 4 of those ways were, I think, really cool to approach the experience, where I wouldn't say, this is exactly what happened. I would say, this happened, but it could be this, and it could be this, and it could be this. And I don't know who these people were because they drove off. And I'm not chasing them because I'm scared.
Yeah, I'm glad that you didn't do that.
Yeah, right.
So you're with us. All right. I think it's exactly the art of this seminar should be finishing on time. So I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of everyone today here. So folks, if you want to get in touch with me or Dee for all the resources that Tony will share, that would be great. We can toast those. So I just want to take a moment to everyone to kind of use your voice to say thank you to Tony, because it has been great and very, very important and very, very useful session. So shall we say thank you with our beautiful voices?
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you very much, Tony.
It was really great.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Absolutely. Anytime. Thank you all for spending time with with me. I geek out over this. This is so much fun.
I think it's easy to understand, to see your passion as well and your interest in the topic. You know, it's very, very easy to see. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. Anytime. Thank you all.